Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Horner, the Director of Education here at the Carlos Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, held in conjunction with the exhibition, Making an Impression, the Art and Craft of Ancient Engraved Gemstones. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to thank museum member Justin Kritz and his wife Robin for making tonight's program possible. Justin is an Emory Law School alumnus with a passion for classics and a wonderful supporter of the Carlos Museum. Thank you to the Kritz family for making the special evening possible, and to all our museum's members for your ongoing support. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Rachel Patt back to Emory. After completing her BA in Classics at Stanford, her MA in Art History at the Courtauld in London, Rachel earned her PhD in Art History here at Emory, graduating in May of 2022. She worked with Eric Varner and Bono Westcott on her dissertation titled Meaning, Materiality, and Pothos in Late Antique Gold Glass Portraits, a subject closely related to the topic of her lecture tonight. While at Emory, Rachel gave talks at the Carlos, had numerous internships and fellowships, but what she is best known for, in fact, what she is legendary for, are the spectacular cakes she made for the annual Art History Department welcome parties, and for her extraordinary cooking skills in general. From 2019 to 2022, she was the David E. Finley Predoctoral Fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art. She is now a Mary Seeger O'Boyle Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Seeger Center for Hellenic Studies at Princeton. In the last 2 years, she has also contributed much to the Making an Impression exhibition, working as a curatorial research assistant to curator Ruth Allen, and contributing an essay titled Reading the Materiality of Gemstones in Greco-Roman Literature to the Digital Catalog. Tonight, she will speak to us on that topic of materiality, a term for the many ways that the matter of things matter. Rachel.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that generous introduction, and to you all for being here both in person and on Zoom. It's really exciting to be back on campus, and it makes me, a little emotional because I only just graduated in May, so it's special to be back here as an alumna. I also wanted to thank Dr. Ruth Allen, who isn't here tonight, but she is the fantastic curator behind the exhibition, for her invitation for my participation, both in tonight's program and into working on the exhibition catalog, as Elizabeth mentioned. So with that being said, if everyone can hear me okay? Yes, okay, I'm gonna get started. Trying to get rid of the cursor. A picture is worth 1,000 words, so the adage goes. In placing a premium on the visual representation of a person, object, scene, or other content, this familiar saying trains us to associate an intrinsic value with the pictorial. Indeed, understanding what works of art depict has long constituted a concern for art historians and more casual observers alike. Within the discipline of art history, iconography centers on the identification, description, and content of pictures, and was championed as a method by highly influential practitioners of the discipline, such as Erwin Panofsky. In the museum sphere, at the same time, gallery texts trend towards the content-based. One prominent US institution's wall label guidelines, for example, instruct that, quote, titles are descriptive and visitor-friendly, and that labels, quote, point out what is interesting or important and explain the iconography and function, close quote. This admittedly cursory sketch is suggestive, however, of the privileged place that the pictorial is held in the interpretation of and our interactions with art. One of my goals in this lecture tonight is to open up for you the toolkit of methodologies with which art historians work beyond iconography, and to consider another powerful means of understanding works of art. Using gemstones and other select media, such as glass, to illustrate the myriad ways materials mattered in the ancient Mediterranean, I will explore with you a mode of thinking about objects beyond their pictorial content. This strategy is known as materiality. And before we delve into the examinations of the Greek and Roman gems that I know are much flashier than methodology and theory, I do want to give you a little bit of clarification as to what I mean precisely by materiality. So if you'll bear with me, materiality as a term seems to defy an easy definition. It's more than a mere medium, although sometimes the two are conflated. It encompasses something of nature as well as culture, and has become over the years a blanket term of sorts for the many ways materials matter in things. Yet materiality exists beyond the realm of concrete things. And here I would like to quote Daniel Miller, who asserts that, quote, "This definition soon breaks down as we move on to consider the large compass of materiality, the ephemeral, the imaginary, the biological, and the theoretical, all that which would have been external to the simple definition of an artifact." There is, therefore, a kind of ambiguity to the term materiality, for it not only extends into these aforementioned realms, it also does reside in things and materials, but also people, because it's bound up in thing-human relationships. This ambiguity does not render it useless, however, but it allows for the term to encapsulate something more about matter than language itself can adequately convey. I find Michael and Hawley's somewhat whimsical conception of materiality to be valuable in striving towards a definition of the term. Materiality, she writes, is, quote, "the meeting of matter and imagination." Her accompanying diagram, which I show you here, of materiality succeeds in getting at the sheer complexity of the term and the vast range of intellectual concepts, thinkers, and interdisciplinary angles the term touches. And you can see on this diagram names of prominent anthropologists, so some of these guys, right? And philosophers, there's Heidegger on there somewhere, and scholars of material culture, thing theory, a lot going on populating this diagram. And one glance at it instantly becomes clear that materiality encompasses an enormous swath of conceptual and philosophical territory. So although an interest of art historians since Abby Warburg, who was working in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, the concept of materiality has witnessed a surge of popularity in recent decades. And the quote unquote material turn in art history has been seen as a reaction to the semiotic or the linguistic turn of the humanities in the scholarship of the 1970s and the 1980s. Indeed, materiality-based approaches have mushroomed so much in subfields of the discipline that they border on passé at this point, and I would be remiss, if I didn't acknowledge that. So, for example, in medieval art history, and here I show you just a smattering of titles related to medieval art history materiality. One established medievalist art historian remarked, quote, "Today, it is difficult to imagine a medieval art history that did not acknowledge how overt materiality is a distinguishing characteristic of medieval art." Yet materiality-based approaches to classical art history, the topic of this lecture, are not quite as well established as in medieval. In calling attention to ancient engagements with materialism, Verity Platt's 2016 essay, "The Matter of Classical Art History," helped to usher in a recent wave of scholarship, privileging these approaches when analyzing the art of the ancient Mediterranean. Furthermore, the field has witnessed a surge in work on lapidary materialities, and here I would point out not only Ruth Allen's dissertation work, which you see manifest in the form of an exhibition, there's also scholars in the early modern period working on stones such as Christopher Nygren, Fabio Barry, who are working on really interesting ways stones mattered and their materiality signified things in the early modern period. So it makes this an opportune moment to reflect on the materiality of ancient gemstones. It should be emphasized that materiality has been around conceptually for millennia and weighed heavily on the consciousness of ancient writers and thinkers. Take the 1st century CE philosopher and naturalist Pliny the Elder, for instance, whose approach to art history in his magnum opus, The Natural History, is framed structurally by materials. And here you can see I've outlined a little portion of the table of contents for you, and it's all by different materials from the earth. We encounter artworks made in precious metals, gemstones, bronze, marble, all examined in the context of the natural resources from which they were crafted. With this mention of Pliny, let's turn to some other ancient authors to begin our exploration of materiality and ancient gemstones. A couplet ascribed to Archias, who was a poet active in Rome in the 1st century BCE and writing in Greek, offers up the following description of an intaglio, and I should specify for those of you who haven't had a chance to visit the exhibition yet, an intaglio is the kind, they're all intaglios here, where they're cut in, literally, that's what the Italian means. So it's as opposed to a cameo. So he's describing an intaglio gemstone here. And the cameo is as opposed in raised relief layers, as opposed to being cut in. So anyhow, so he offers the following description. Looking at the cow and the jasper on my hand, you will fancy that the cows breathe and the jasper puts forth grass. In the compact form of the epigram, the poet crafts a vivid ekphrasis, or a verbal representation of an object of art. And in this ekphrasis, the use of the 2nd person to address the reader directly creates an atmosphere of intimate proximity, as Archias invites his readers to look at the engraved stone worn on his body as a ring, implicitly praising the excellence of the carving by evoking the highly mimetic, even animated cows. He also exploits the material and physical qualities of the stone to poetic effect. Archias toys with perceptions of scale by juxtaposing this tiny intaglio with the capacious pastoral vista contained within its border. Moreover, by explicitly referencing the gem's green hue, Archias assimilates the jasper to a lush and verdant pasture, providing a realistic setting for the grazing cows. The poem brings to mind extant ancient gems, such as this exquisite intaglio carved and signed by Dexamenos of Chios, and it's now in the State Hermitage Museum, on which a heron is depicted against a calm background of blue chalcedony, doubly reminding of the sky through which it soars and the water from which it took its flight. Another epigram, this one attributed to Plato, depicts a similar phenomenon. The little jasper stone is carved with 5 cows, all looking alive as they feed. Perhaps they would run away, but now the little herd is confined in the golden pen. Here, the play between crafted image and the physicality of the gem is even more pronounced, as Plato likens the golden ring setting in which the jasper is mounted to a feeding pen. The attention that these writers bring to the material qualities of the gems that they describe underscores the importance of not just the figural imagery of these cows engraved on gemstones, but also the physical properties and sensations such as size, haptic or tactile engagement, and color. Modern viewers of ancient gems are easily awestruck by the minute incisions that coalesce to create miniature images on impossibly tiny surfaces of these stones. And for anyone who's seen the exhibition, you know that some of these stones are truly the size of your pinky fingernail. They're impossibly tiny. And I'll show you here, this is quite actually a remarkable level of detail for a small stone. It's known as the Felix gem after the signature, and it's just 3.5 centimeters in width. it's actually, just to dwell on this a little bit, it's remarkable. You've got a signature, you've got multiple figures, you've got a depiction, in miniature on the miniature, you've got a dead body. I mean, like you've got architecture. It's a lot. So anyhow, it's easy. My point is that it's easy to marvel at the images on these tiny stones. But I want to underscore throughout this lecture that the physical engagement and the material qualities of these gemstones was just as important as this riveting iconography. So no discussion of classical glyptic and poetry could be complete without the mention of one of our most mesmerizing textual sources on gemstones, and that's Posidippus's Lithica, which comes down to us preserved on this papyrus. So this was actually discovered, used as stuffed up stuffing for mummy wrappings. And that's how these poems survive and were transported to us. It was a mere act of recycling and like dumb luck that we have this written source. And here's an image of that papyrus. So probably composed around 230 to 200 BCE, the Lithica form a group of thematically clustered poems at the opening of a roll containing 112 epigrams. And these poems address topics as diverse as divination and omens, renowned bronze sculptures, and equestrian victories. The Lithica section constitute a particularly celebrated portion of the Milan papyrus, for not only is it a crucial source on ancient attitudes towards gems, but also there are these amazing metapoetics at play in the epigrams in emulating the dexterously carved miniature stones in this similarly polished miniature poetic format. So as Posidippus wends his way through highly wrought descriptions of gemstones, both carved and uncarved, his verses demonstrate common concerns present throughout the Lithica. For example, he references the foreign provenances of many gems featuring in the poems, lending an exotic mystique and evoking expanded geopolitics following the conquests of Alexander the Great. Here I show you a map of the gem and mineral mines in the ancient world. And there are some fantastic maps for those of you who've seen that exhibition that are showing similar didactic content to this image, but maybe slightly newer research about where the sources came from. But look at the breadth of that Alexander the Great's conquests open up. We're talking Indian, Persian, Arabian origins repeatedly cited in Posidippus as the source of these jewels, conjuring up a literary image of this vast new world. The poet also takes care to describe the devices engraved on various intaglios and to name carvers, customers, and recipients, weaving a complex network of patronage, power, and interpersonal relationships, constellating around the elite exchange of jewels. In addition to what might be considered conventional art historical concerns with, artists, patrons, and iconography, these epigrams attend closely to the material and physical qualities of the gems themselves. The sparkle of stones, for example, might be considered a refrain that shimmers throughout the Lithica. A ruby, quote, blazes, lapis lazuli sparkles, an intaglio glitters and is described as a shimmering cube of light. A cornelian gleams, but to offer a handful of examples of Posidippus's attention to the luminosity and the brilliance of his subject matter. Reflectivity of surface is underscored, and the transfer of radiance from gem to wearer is conveyed. Moreover, the poet offers several examples in which the inherent luminosity of the gem is enhanced artificially to heighten further this aesthetic quality. In AB 13, he writes, "This is a tricky stone. Smear it with oil, and all around it swims in radiance, a marvel of deceit. But when it's dry, all of a sudden the Persian lacuna, some kind of gem, lightens, reaching for the beautiful sun. In this epigram, Posidippus draws attention to the changeability of the sparkle of a gem depending on how it is manipulated by the viewer, highlighting the importance of physical qualities of the stone to its appreciation. AB 13 reminds the reader that jewels were actively examined, handled, and engaged tactilely in order to marvel best at their dazzling material qualities. And enhanced as well. I mean, this idea that you're going to put oil on it to draw out the radiance is really, really interesting. And we see this addition or this manipulation in a similar epigram, AB 11, which takes as its subject matter, precious mother of pearl shell. And that poem similarly just demonstrates how the viewer might enhance the sparkle of an already naturally luminous material. Its closing lines note that, quote, there's a film of wax over the surface, keeping the light on the image rising now to our gaze. The handler of the precious shell, having already been described as possessing a gleam comparable to topaz, exploits to great effect the innate brilliance of the material with the addition of a wax coating that heightens this gleam. A playful exploitation of gemstone color and subject matter in AB 14 recalls the double connotations of green jewels and verdant pastures and the epigrams from the Palatine anthology with which this lecture opened. The poem reads, Pegasus etched upon misty jasper, the artist's hand and mind working together. I've caught it superbly. Bellerophon has fallen to Cilicia's Aeolian plain. His colt has pranced off into the deep blue sky. And so he carved him on this ethereal stone, free of the reins, shuddering still at the bit. The winged horse of the hero was a recurrent subject on classical intaglios, and I'm showing you a few of them here, including one in the Carlos. And Posidippus has beautifully captured this verbal image of the beast taking flight through a cerulean expanse that is at once the sky and the physical gem, much like Dexamenos's heron that I showed you. Posidippus also draws attention to gems' small scale in several epigrams in sophisticated and often ironic ways, for their diminutiveness is just part of the picture. James Porter, who's a very renowned scholar on ancient aesthetics, notes how while the jewels that form the subject of the Lithica are individually minuscule in dimensions, and consider, for instance, the poet's remark in AB 15 regarding one jewel, that it was miraculous that the carver did not damage his eyesight while fashioning the subject. So microscopically tiny was the engraved device. This minuteness is juxtaposed throughout the Lithica with large-scale, grand themes, such as the wide-ranging geographies from which the jewels originate, macroscopic cosmic phenomena, such as the sun, moon, and stars. Moreover, these miniature gems are frequently described in terms of their bulk, or ogkos in Greek, and heft, or in terms of their dimensions. And James Porter observes that there's a tension between compact, miniaturized scale and perceived mass and magnitude is a crucial tension, both physically and conceptually, to the epigram's interpretation and complication of typical reading of Hellenistic epigram as a refined rejection of the monumental. I want to linger a moment on gems, the small scale, and the ways in which the classical world was enthralled with extremes of magnitude. The attraction of the miniature is deceptively simple. Small things, as we've seen in the show, are inherently fascinating. Yet underneath that surface fascination are complex mechanics of appeal that have only been explicitly theorized in the last 30 years or so. Susan Stewart's seminal 1984 essay on longing, Narratives of the Miniature, the Gigantic, the Souvenir, the Collection, provided the underpinnings of what is termed miniaturization theory, in articulating how the small scale inspires wonderment and acts as an analogy of interiority of the self. Scholars of material culture, in turn, have taken these analyses and transformed them into more concrete applications to works of art. Methodologies of miniaturization can be rooted in the phenomenology of the living body, which draws on Maurice Merleau-Ponty's work on the structures of experience, in foregrounding the subjective experience of the human user of the miniature. Miniaturization theory also engages discourse of materiality and anthropological agency, for these modes of thinking also underscore the capacity of the physical characteristics of a tiny object to exert influence over the human beholder. Finally, scholars have recently engaged questions of how scale impacts the ontological perception of objects, and have underscored how traditional modes of art historical analysis can distort our understanding of scale. And if anyone is interested on that, you should read a really fantastic book by Andrew Hamilton called Scale and the Incas, which really points out the ways scale can be culturally predetermined and how we need to break down our thinking. Anyhow, back to the point. An active, intentional fascination in the ancient Mediterranean with scale becomes clear by the Hellenistic period. The parallel flourishing of epigram poetry, a format characterized by its brevity, as we've seen, has been noted by scholars as testimony to this fascination. The art historian Michael Squire, for instance, has highlighted how the Latin poet Martial's series of compact poems on miniaturized versions of quite epic literary works, including Homer and Virgil, are examples of a deliberate toying with teeny scale and yet drawing attention to the artist's and poet's ability to capture multum in parvo, or much succinctly in little. The trope of taking grand subject matter and shrinking it down was popular not only in epigrams like Martial's, but in concretely material forms such as gemstones, as well as fully three-dimensional statuettes, like this miniature replica in glass of the Augustus Prima Porta style. So here I'm showing you the statue, and this is itty bitty. So there's a dynamic interest in dimensions of scale going on, reverberating across visual and verbal media, indicating a significant investment in the miniature in antiquity. So a miniature work of art, such as a gemstone, renders the spectator omniscient and omnipotent by physically making him or her gigantic. At the same time, though subjugated to the manipulations of the viewer, the intaglio exerts its own influence by demanding intimacy of observation. Of a scale that requires personal handling or close examination, perhaps even with a magnifying lens, as in the exhibition, touching and examination for it to be seen, the miniature asserts its physical status and its potential to transfer, to signify a tremendous amount of meaning concentrated in a tiny amount of matter. And I think for those of you who haven't had a chance to visit the exhibition yet, but who are going to, that very last iPad in the last gallery that's talking about the RTI technology and how you move a light source over the image of the gem, kind of mimics the way you might have held it in your hand, and the way your engagement with it changes what you can actually see. I think that's a really valuable exercise. So play with that if you haven't done so yet in the galleries. And I'm sorry for those on Zoom that I keep referring to the exhibition. It's a wonderful exhibition. And for those of you who are in Georgia, you should come see it. Anyhow, the paradox of Posidippus's bulky and hefty miniature stones stands alongside other physical qualities we see populating his description of gems. The aforementioned sparkle and glitter, luminosity, visual complexity, which is known as poikilia in Greek, and engagement of light's varied and rippling surface effects, displays of deft craftsmanship. These properties form essential elements of a particular aesthetics that extends back to the poetry of Homer and Hesiod. And this is an aesthetics of wonder, which is thauma in the Greek. Literary descriptions of marvelous objects or wonders to behold for themselves and for oneself clearly establish a set of materially linked properties, such as those which Posidippus employs in the Lithica, that result in the evocation of the wondrous. And one example here will suffice to briefly establish the aesthetics of wonder as evoked by the materiality of Posidippus's gemstones, and it comes from a passage of Book 19 of the Odyssey. A fleecy cloak of purple did noble Odysseus wear, a cloak of double fold, but the brooch upon it was fashioned of gold with double clasps, and on the front it was curiously wrought. A hound held in its forepaws a dappled fawn, and gazed at it as it writhed. And then, at this, all men marveled how, though they were of gold, the hound was gazing at the fawn and strangling it, and the fawn was writhing with its feet and striving to flee. And I noted the tunic about his, Odysseus's body, all shining as is the sheen upon the skin of a dried onion. So sheer it was and soft, and it glistened like the sun. So the passage begins with a pair of references of doubled features in Odysseus's clothing and adornment, this doubly folded cloak and the double clasped pin, previewing the doubleness of the pin's decoration that will center at the heart of this description, and emphasizing the double valence of the object. It continues highlighting the craftsmanship of the pin, and this is daidalon in ancient Greek, and that adjective itself invokes an embodiment of the mythic virtuosity of the creator Daedalus, who was the one who made, for example, the labyrinth in Crete. In the description of the pin's figural decoration, we encounter recognizable ingredients of wonder, visual complexity, again, that's the poikilia I mentioned, brilliance, the animation of the inanimate. The fawn is dappled, the adornment's figures actively thrash and suppress, and this suppression, in effect, is more marvelous is because it's taking the life away from something that is already lifeless. The brightness and radiance of the pin are extended to Odysseus's garments as well, emphatically described as shining and glistening with the intensity of the sun. With this pin, in just a handful of verses, Homer has created a visually dazzling marvel that brilliantly condenses many ingredients of wonder within one object, finely wrought both as a fictional object of craft and as a poetic tour de force. So with these aesthetics of wonder in mind, we can return to the Lithica and contend that the epigrams frame gems as marvels experienced materially. An examination of the instances the poet references wonder reveals this framing. Take poem AB8's description of a bright, luminous ruby as a wonder, AB13's oil-smeared stone, which we looked at earlier, as a thauma of deceit or a wonder of deceit, and the incredibly minuscule carving of the stone in AB15, so marvelously small that, quote, you wouldn't see the chariot except in the imprint, or feel a crease on the surface. In this adroit crafting of tightly composed epigrams that contrast extremes of magnitude within a few brief lines of poetry, and that take on subject matter that materially recalls the aesthetic qualities of wonder, Posidippus generates a wonder of his own in the poems. And in turn, this is a kind of side note, but the Lithica, I would argue, belong to a genre of paradoxography which is writing on the wondrous, the unbelievable, and the strange. And this is a genre that emerged in the Hellenistic period. Roughly 3 centuries later, Pliny the Elder concludes his encyclopedia on the topic of gems and continually writes of them in terms of their materiality. Given pride of place at the end of his project, and if you recall that table of contents I showed you earlier, Gems is the last book in his encyclopedia, gemstones are praised as the pinnacle of nature's terrestrial materials that Pliny spent the previous 36 books of the encyclopedia chronicling. Book 37 opens with the following proclamation. In order that the work that I have undertaken may be complete, it remains for me to discuss gemstones. Here, nature's grandeur is gathered together within the narrowest limits, and in no domain of hers evokes more wonder in the minds of many who set such store by the variety, the colors, the texture, and the elegance of gems that they think it a crime to tamper with certain kinds by engraving them as signets, although this is the prime reason for their use. While some they consider to be beyond price and to defy evaluation in terms of human wealth. Hence, very many people find that a single gemstone alone is enough to provide them with a supreme and perfect aesthetic experience of the wonders of nature. Celebrated for their variety, which again is this aspect of poikilia, variety that I keep mentioning, color, texture, and elegance, which I find very interesting. Gems are encapsulations in tiny amounts of matter of nature's wonders. Indeed, with regards to color, we know that recipes for altering the color of gemstones existed in antiquity and actually date back to ancient Mesopotamia. Pliny himself advocates the use of Corsican honey to enhance the color of gemstones, which may seem like a strange proposition, but actually scientifically this works because when it's heated, the honey penetrates the microstructure of the mineral and it caramelizes or carbonizes the gemstones, which in turn enhances the color. So for Pliny, a single jewel, as we see here in these last lines, is sufficient to provide an all-encompassing immersive aesthetic experience. Moreover, the inviolable material perfection of a gem is such that Pliny notes the very criminality of corrupting its surface with iconography. Throughout book 37, again, this last book of the encyclopedia dedicated to gemstones, Pliny underscores the material dynamism of gemstones, particularly their tactile experience. For instance, when writing of amber, which was considered alongside gemstones and rock crystal in the same category of materials, he observes that when amber is actively rubbed, it gives off the scent of a species of pine, and he later notes that such tactile engagement releases its heat. Touching and rubbing certain stones can rob them of their innate glow. It can instill them with a kind of magnetic attraction to straw and papyrus fibers, and it can even produce a milky perspiration. Pliny's insistence on the tactile reminds us that the materiality of ancient gemstones is bound up in scale, context, and functionality. While we might be prone to approaching carved jewels as refined objects of art, it remains to be underscored that their use as personal adornment lent them an air of intimate contact with the wearer and contributed to their experience as tactile, sensuous articles of embellishment. And so this is actually a replica of this is an exhibition. You can see painted portraits and textiles depict, people wearing many a finger ring. But this also testifies to the physical proximity of gems' attachment to the body and the restricted spheres of viewing such objects. The insistence on the tactility of stones and the need to touch or rub them to activate certain material properties indicates an approach to gems that transcends just their visuals, reminding the modern reader/viewer of the multisensory manners in which people engaged with jewels in antiquity. Okay, bear with me here. We're going to go like a little history of science for just a tiny bit. But I want to talk about the mechanics of sight in antiquity, because I think if we talk a little bit about the mechanics of sight in antiquity, it'll enrich our understanding of how the physicality of gemstones played such an important role in their multisensory engagement. Sight was bound up in issues of size and tactility that work to result in an increasingly intimate relationship with the object being viewed. And I know you're wondering, sight is sight, how is it tactile? Well, hold. The sense of sight, held as supreme importance over the other senses, was conceived of in competing models. So this is a fun diagram. The extromissive theory of sight posited that vision emanates from fiery rays cast outward by the eyes, traveling to the thing seen. Okay, so extra out. As opposed to the intromissive theory, which proposed that the visible objects gave off idola, or atom-thick replicas that moved through space and tactilely penetrated the eye. Okay, so regardless of whether you're on team extramission or intromission, the Greeks and Romans understood sight in utterly tactile terms. These tactile conceptions of vision draw our attention to the sense of touch as a crucial player in our visual experience of an object. So this notion of haptic viewing draws on a visual awareness of the material properties of the thing being seen. Okay, for the last bit of the lecture, I want to shift gears away from our digression in the history of science and to another digression and think about the relationship between gems and glass materially. And I do hope you'll indulge me in this, because I know you primarily came to hear about gemstones, but I love glass. And they're related. You may have noticed, for those of you who have been into the exhibition, that there are several cases of glass objects. Glass gems populates parts of this exhibition, and there's a reason for that. Now, okay, so you may have spotted, for example, this one is glass at the center. These are, quote, real gems, right? And so there are many fanciful gems that imitate, in glass, that imitate the striations of banded agates. These are all in the show, and here I'm showing you glass gems on the sides, flanking the banded agate intaglio at the center. And then here, lastly, this is an engraved green glass gem at the left that recalls other hardstone counterparts. It's no coincidence that glass gems appear to mimic their glyptic counterparts. For very early in glass's history, glassmakers drew on rare, precious media such as gemstones for inspiration. Again, these material qualities, the range of colors preserved, attest to the intentional imitation of precious and semi-precious stones like lapis lazuli by Egyptian glassmakers as early as the mid-2nd millennium BCE. The color schemes of Egyptian vessels, jugs, and flasks often mirrored a recognizable set of other media. And for example, I'm showing you a blue jug with delicate enameled yellow and white decoration, which probably was intended to recall similarly shaped vessels in turquoise decorated with gold and silver. Other fabrics of glass imitated alabaster, and by the late classical period, colorless glass tablewares were being manufactured in the Persian Empire, whose decorative schemes echoed the motifs of Persian silver and bronze vessels. These glass versions were extremely prized for their mimicry of these other media, both in Persia and in the ancient Mediterranean world that was revolutionized by the conquests of Alexander the Great. So Alexander's conquests, as we saw on the map, had an enormous impact on the availability of materials such as emeralds, sapphires, and garnets. And these all had previously been restricted to the east. And I would point, back to that map at the beginning of the presentation, and also the maps in the exhibition to remind you of the sources. But the luxury arts of the Hellenistic world and later in Rome were directly inspired by Persian artworks, media, and aesthetics. So these colorless glass tablewares that I've mentioned that were so appreciated by the Macedonian royalty and elites drew from Achaemenid antecedents both in glass and rock crystal. And a class of mosaic glass that deliberately imitated banded agate vessels emerged as well. And so here I'm showing you, I think, this really nice juxtaposition, the bowl, which is actually in the precious stone, and the aspiring glass version. And such opulent mosaic glass vessels were probably made in the Eastern Mediterranean, but were widely dispersed across the entire region. And gold band glass, by introducing gold in its polychrome undulations, pushed the visual that was available between glass and striated stones further than nature's boundaries, by invoking simultaneously a natural source of inspiration and outdoing the preciousness of earthly materials with its added sparkle. And here I'm showing you some pictures of a gold band glass alabastron. It's on loan to Carlos. And you see how the addition of the gold in the striations pushes beyond the capacity of sardonyx or onyx, these banded agates, to become even more brilliant, even more sparkling. The aesthetics of hard stones and precious gemstones shaped taste making in ancient glass production. In his discussion of glass in the natural history, Pliny reserves the highest praise for vessels that actively imitated other vessels made out of amethyst, sapphire, rock crystal, lapis lazuli, and especially those made out of mura. I don't think this is a great image, but this is one of the rare examples of murine ware, which is now identified as fluorspar. And this was so prized in the ancient world. This Octavian, later Augustus, so was taken with this material that despite his reputation for humility and a sort of not impoverished, but basic house, right? He takes a single item from the treasury of the Ptolemies when he defeats Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. What does he take? He takes one bowl out of this material. So the substance was admired for its shifting veins of color, and the glass vessels that Pliny described as murine in quality were likely a veined or bicolored fused mosaic glass that evoked these variegations of color that we see in the gemstone. How am I doing on time? Good. Okay. I'm almost done. I just wanted to I could save this for a question. So I'm gonna say probably enough on glass. Thank you for indulging me, for allowing me to explore these connections between these related materials and how the aesthetics and properties of one can really influence another. But enough on glass. And in wrapping up, I would like to say that I'm going to quote that 2016 essay by Verity Platt that I mentioned at the start of this talk. She encourages us in our reception of antiquity, quote, to listen to the silence of the objects themselves. By considering ancient gems in terms of their physical and aesthetic qualities, these captivating objects, which are so enthralling for the impossible minuteness of their imagery, they're given an equal means to speak out through their materiality, as wonders to be appreciated and as intimate objects to be handled closely and examined carefully. Though operating in a milieu of human actors who carve, exchange, and wear them, gems harness through their materiality a kind of power derived from their wondrous nature. By partaking in an aesthetics of thelma or wonder, gemstones communicate powerful connotations of their material properties and assert their status as miniature marvels sensorially experienced in antiquity. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That was fabulous. I loved it. So now we can take questions, and I will bring the microphone around and ask you to please speak into it so that people on Zoom can hear the questions. Who has one? Okay.
Did the carvers use magnifying glasses or glass?
Okay, so that's really interesting. Have you seen the exhibition yet?
Yes.
Okay, did you watch the video with Chavdar making the gem with the ancient tools?
Yes.
Did you see how he had all of this magnifying apparatus? We don't actually know that people in antiquity worked with such a setup. In fact, scholars tend to think that they were doing it tactilely. They were doing it blindly visually, but doing it tactilely as they went along, like wiping off the slurry and the grit and feeling the carving as they were making out the design. And I think that's really remarkable. I mean, I would also point again to Posidipus's poem where he marvels at the guy not losing his eyesight, which would again suggest that no one is using a magnifying lens. But on a related note, some people in antiquity did like to use gemstones for their optical magnifying qualities. So that was another way. Nero, I want to say. Yeah. Nero, my advisor's favorite emperor, used what? An emerald. Emerald, right? He prized a particular emerald for viewing games. Yeah. Circus games through. So people did magnify. That's a roundabout way of saying people did magnify stuff in antiquity, but it is not known that gem carvers were using magnification.
Well, for people who haven't seen the exhibit, I really, really would recommend that video.
Video is going to be online.
It's fascinating.
It's really wonderful.
It's a wonder. Yes.
Thank you, Rachel, for that wonderful talk. As one of the people constructing the digital catalog, which will be available by the end of October, I just want to encourage everyone to please use the digital catalog. And we are finding a way to incorporate those RTI images into the catalog. So you can actually mimic that experience of handling the gems on the catalog as well, thanks to this lovely choir program we're using from the Getty. So for people on Zoom, I just wanted to make that announcement and encourage you to keep your eyes out for the catalog and Rachel and everyone else's wonderful essays within. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Annie, because that's a really valid point that those of you participating on Zoom from across the country, aren't able, for example, to interact with that iPad in the last gallery that I was mentioning, but if you're able to go online and the online catalog has those RTI interactive photos, you'll be able to do the same. So thanks, Annie.
So fascinating talk. I am particularly interested in the connection between the notion of the materiality of the stone and portraits on them. Is there a way for us to say that certain portraits are made in certain stones, possibly even to convey like certain characteristics of the subject, or do you think that would be too far of a supposition?
I'm going to think about that one for a second. Room goes dead silent. I don't know. I actually was the one who wrote the catalog entries for all the portrait gems. in the show. And I totally admit none of these three that keep popping up on my text slides are in the show. I just like them. As portrait gems, I'm a portrait person in my research, so that's why they're there. They're also fabulous. But I in my writing of those catalog entries, I wasn't even thinking about materiality. I was thinking about iconography. And so I think it would be really interesting to push your question and maybe push me to marry my interests in materiality and portraiture and think a little harder about the answer to that question, because when you go online eventually at the end of October and look at those catalog entries on the portrait gems in the exhibition, they're not particularly materiality driven entries.
We have a question on Zoom. Let me
Mhm.
get to the back to read it. And while I get back there, I'll just ask you my question. The stone that the vessel that Octavian Augustus loved, was that part of it, its rarity, and where does it come from? Where was it mined?
That's something, Elizabeth, that I was looking at that map in the exhibition for where does the Mura come from? I don't know. I don't actually know where it's sourced from.
Elizabeth
No, we don't
Torreson,
know. So the two surviving examples that are in the British Museum, and I showed you one of them, those have a fine spot from Turkey, right? And so, but they could have been imported. So we don't actually know where that legendary material came from. It is extremely rare. It was very expensive. And I could give you statistics about how many comparable vats of fine wine it took to equate one vessel in this stone, or how many human slaves did it one vessel. So these were very costly resources, very rare.
interesting. Okay, let me read this question from Jordan Dopp. Hi, thank you for your talk. Speaking of the agency of the media, I would love to hear more of your thoughts on the wearers, either alive or dead, use of a gemstone for its material properties. For example, the evil eye phenomenon, warding off evil, and the incorporation of specific gems into mummy cartonnages.
That's a really great question. Something that this talk didn't really touch on was the use of many gemstones for magical or amuletic kinds of uses. And there were definite correlations between the amuletic functions of gemstones and the materials. Certain materials were thought to ward off certain diseases, etc., or drunkenness, whatever, right? Certain conditions. And so there was a relationship certainly between when there was this kind of protective or amuletic nature to it and the material from which it was made. I cannot talk about the evil eye. I don't actually know a lot about the evil eye. So I'm just going to admit ignorance on that one, but I wrote it down and I'm going to look that up.
Quick question. You mentioned, I think, the use of oil to increase luminosity. And I'm assuming it was olive oil. And did it not damage the gemstone?
No, I don't think that it would have damaged the gemstone because those surfaces, I'm not speaking as an expert on the Mohs scale of hardness, but that there's a scale of hardness. Diamond is at the top. And I don't think actually that the porousness of the gemstones we're talking about would have been impacted negatively by olive oil. That's my hypothesis. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, MOHS is the Mohs scale of hardness. Diamonds at the top.
One more question here in the back.
I was curious about your thoughts on glass and like the glass like busts and portraiture, if you'd like to talk about that, the prevalence of it. And I was interested in the glass bust of Augustus and if it had any like comparanda that we've identified.
Yeah, so there are actually a couple different points to that question. The comparanda, I'll start with the comparanda. That one is truly spectacular. There is one in Florence that's not in glass, but a related material. It's in faience. That is also a tiny Augustus, and it was in the Medici treasury. So if you look, the volume on that, if you're interested, is Splendida Minima. So kind of related to vitreous materials. There were also glass, small portrait busts in glass that were from probably Falerii, which were these like decorative medallions. Don't really know how else to describe them, but we have some fairly sizable little guys in sculpted relief in glass, from and they're always cobalt blue, if that's of particular interest. Can you remind me what was the rest of your question? I'm sorry.
Because I don't know if you've seen it, but there is an imperial, I believe it's imperial. There's an imperial bust in blue glass in the Carlos, but we don't know who it is. It's not Augustus, it's not Tiberius, it's not Claudius. Dr. Varner knows what I'm talking about.
I'm like, I don't know what that is. That's fascinating. In terms of imperial personages, I don't actually know. I would say, like, in terms of prestige of the material, I could keep you hostage here for a long time talking about whether glass was a prestigious material or not in antiquity, right? And so various people have various different arguments, and I could point you to the debate between Michael Vickers and E. Marianne Stern about whether there was a hierarchy of media in this aspirational, imitational way I was talking about glass, or whether there were other properties of glass in their own right that really made it a compelling and prestigious medium. That's where I fall. There are ways that like, for example, that tiny little glass Augustus was cold worked. So it's the stage of working. There's the initial stage of glass working where the raw material is made, glass, and then the glass is heated in the hot working stage, right? The secondary stage of working to form it. And then cold working of the tertiary stage is when you're actually dealing with already cast or blown glass to create, for example, cameo glass. There's glass that evokes cameo gemstones, where people were treating it like a gem surface. That was actually one of the slides I skipped because I thought, who wants to hear about this? But anyhow, the cold working of the glass Augustus is something that would elevate its prestige as an object, as opposed to just a secondarily worked glass object.
Thank you, Rachel. I just wanted to say that William Size, Bill Size, who is Professor Emeritus of Environmental Studies here at Emory, and a geologist who has done so much wonderful work for the Carlos and was very involved in this show, has joining us tonight by Zoom and has said in the chat that fluorspar or fluorite was found in Cumbria, England. It is still mined there as an ornamental stone, and it is very soft and breaks easily. So thank you, Bill, for.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I in fact learn something new every day.
A couple more questions if you have time.
Yeah, of course.
Brent Cavedo says, how does the surface texture of gemstones compare with the aesthetics effects of surfaces and finish finishes in various artistic media? This, I guess,
That's a very hard question because there are so many different media that one could point to for comparison. However, I would say the surface effects of gemstones, especially when we're talking about intaglios, are inherently wanting to draw on the tactile nature. In fact, we saw that in some of the Post-Oedipus poems, right? That if you would miss the surface engraving if you didn't touch it. In terms of other media, like how surface effects, if I understood the question correctly, compare to other media. Again, I could hold you hostage in here for a long time. We could talk about, the ways that sculptures in marble were finished such that both you would appreciate the brilliance and the luster of the marble and the grain of the size that lends a sparkle to it, but they also might have had washes of color and details and color added on that would have allowed you to see something polychrome while still retaining the sparkle of the marble. Not sure I totally understood the question, and I'm sorry about that.
and then our last question for the night, and it is from Alex Hathaway. Were gemstones also valued for artistic individuality? Was there an almost personal relationship between the artist and the owner, meaning that this is a work done by a single artist, not a team?
Yes. So I think actually one of the catalog essays is going to be on is on artists and makers. I think that's Ken's essay, maybe. But patrons had relationships with gem engravers. For example, we know that Alexander the Great allowed only 3 people to make his image. And one of those image makers was specified was a gem carver. So people in power absolutely had close personal relationships to gem engravers.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for coming. I also just want to state before we close that there are many other programs coming up. Next Thursday, Lisbeth Thorson, who is a specialist in the trade and location of the sites where these gemstones were mined, will be here. On October 23rd, Sunday, Kenneth Lepatton from the Getty will be talking about the engravers, the artists, the miners.
The reason why I'm standing
Yes.
here,
That will
basically
be
the one who got me to do a PhD with Professor Varner.
So Ken will be back in Atlanta to give the Laszlo Excalibur Endowed lecture. And then in November, the week of November 7th, Chavdar Chuchev, who's a renowned gem carver, originally from Bulgaria, now living in LA, will return to the Carlos. I don't know how many of you were here when Chavdar was here the last time, but he'll be doing gallery talks and a curatorial conversation with Ruth Allen. And also you can sign up for a gem carving workshop where you too can do it. Only the power source has changed. So thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it and look forward to seeing you again. Good night.